Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Noah Carl. Hello, Noah. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, Noah. So, Noah, you are one of our better writers and dissident on the right. You identify as a conservative. Today, we're going to discuss many interesting issues, but first, I would like to talk about intelligence. Noah, do intelligent people think like economists? This is in light of a paper you wrote some years ago titled Verbal Intelligence is Correlated with Socially and Economically Liberal Beliefs.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, they do appear to think like economists. That was actually the title of a paper by Brian Kaplan, the economist at George Mason University, and one of his co-authors. They looked at various items in the General Social Survey, which is a big household survey, which is done frequently in the United States. And each of the items they selected pertain to some economic phenomenon. And they argued that persons who answered one end of the scale on each item must understand economics better than those who answered at the other end of the scale on the item. And they found consistently that people who scored higher on the vocabulary test in the General Social Survey were more likely to think like economists, which means more likely to see a role for markets, more likely to oppose make-work schemes and to oppose unnecessary government intervention, more likely to support free trade, those kinds of things.
But why is this so?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure we have a definitive answer. There are several theories as to why this might be. One is obviously that perhaps educated people are more likely to have read up on economics and absorbed the lessons of economic theory. Another is perhaps self-interest, in that policies that could be described as ones that economists would recommend perhaps serve the interests of persons with higher than average incomes, which is where you find more intelligent people. And hence, that's why those intelligent people support the relevant policies. For example, perhaps free trade brings in cheaper goods for such people to buy. Perhaps lack of government intervention in certain markets means that business owners and highly paid employees are better off. So that's another explanation.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's a more complicated speculative theory as well, which is based on the ideas of Satoshi Kanazawa, developed later by Edward Dutton, which is that people with higher intelligence tend to have less instinctual preferences. The reason being that intelligence, as these scholars have argued, general intelligence evolved to solve evolutionarily novel problems. It's a general purpose problem-solving tool, and hence it allowed us to, during the course of our evolution, solve problems of a general nature that we wouldn't have encountered to the same extent or the same frequency in the past. And it's possible that a relative average preference for the kinds of policies that economists recommend represents a manifestation of non-instinctual preferences. For example, in our evolutionary past, there was no extended order, there was no sort of decentralized market to coordinate activity, or at least only relatively late in the course of human evolution, where there are sort of primitive markets between different groups that might have traded shells and things. And so perhaps these sort of pro-market or pro-economist views that have been documented by Brian Kaplan and others reflect a non-instinctual preference set on the part of highly intelligent people.
I agree with Edward Newton. I was actually going to posit that point. Intelligent people are able to reason beyond instinct. So, for example, there is a documented relationship between free trade and growth. However, it is more plausible to assume that protectionism can build a nation state. Therefore, someone who is intelligent is better able to judge the benefits of free trade.
Yes, I think that's a good example of where intuitively one might imagine that the best thing to do is to keep foreign products out, the better to build up your own industries. In fact, in many circumstances, perhaps not all circumstances, but in many circumstances, it's better to bring in those foreign products and get them at a low price so that you can develop other industries that may use those products.
And intelligence is also correlated with rationality, although the relationship, according to some scholars, is not necessarily clear. So, for example, increasing the minimum wage is a soundbite, but the data indicate that the minimum wage has the potential to lower working hours, and usually the minimum wage does more harm than good. So intelligent people are also more impartial and less emotionally invested in certain policies. Would you agree?
Yes, I haven't looked in detail at the literature on that question, but I'm inclined to say that on some issues, more intelligent people might be more emotionally invested, not necessarily issues like the minimum wage, but ones in which really important sacred values are at stake. So issues pertaining to, you know, the hot button issues of the culture wars like race
And
and
climate
gender and
change.
trans, perhaps climate change too, although I suspect that one isn't quite as subject to this possible effect as issues like race and trans.
And Noah, I survey the data quite frequently, and I'm still unclear as to the relationship between extremism and intelligence. Some argue that intelligent people are likely to be extreme because their IQ allows them to intellectualize nonsense, whereas others disagree, noting that extremists are often people who are not so bright.
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by extremism. I mean, intelligent people
So, for example,
sometimes,
an extreme
sorry,
Marxist, for example,
I'm sorry.
an extreme Marxist, for example, so a professor with extreme views pertaining to Marxism.
Yes, well, in order to establish whether intelligence, cognitive ability is related to some set of beliefs in general, one has to have a reasonably representative sample of the population. And then one has to look at that sample and see whether the people with the highest intelligence test scores exhibit this belief more so than people with with lower intelligence test scores. I haven't seen any studies specifically looking at, say, Marxist beliefs. Um, it's quite possible that on average, Marxism is more popular among people who are highly intelligent because those who are less intelligent, you know, haven't heard about it. It's not very widely discussed in Western countries nowadays, or at least not to the same extent as during the Cold War. And it's possible that therefore the only people who bother to learn about it and
Yes,
become familiar with it are
yes.
intelligent people who go to university, for example. But on the point about extreme views, if you mean by extreme scoring at one end of a scale, then there is a respect in which intelligent people are more extreme and that they consistently score at the most socially liberal end of the scale when attitudes such as traditional gender roles, abortion, gay marriage, legalization of marijuana are concerned. But I wouldn't necessarily call that extremism in the sense that the term is used in the media, but it is extreme in the sense of it's at one end of a scale.
And what's also fascinating is that one study published by Cambridge indicates that intelligent countries are likely to support redistribution. And I didn't read all of the study. I read the abstract and bits and pieces. I will read the study another time because I plan to interview the writer. But I do believe that intelligent people support the welfare state in order to promote their self-interest. So, for example, economic historians argue that the poor relief system mitigated the effects of innovations. Therefore, elites were better able to invest because of the awareness that ordinary people were not going to revolt. So this could be a possible reason as to why rich countries support the welfare state.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. And of course, uh, in the United States, there has been some evidence that the relationship between support for welfare and intelligence is actually U-shaped, such so that the people with low intelligence scores who tend to benefit from the welfare state have high levels of support, but also those with high intelligence test scores, such that people in the middle or the say 70th, 80th percentile are the most opposed to welfare measures. It should be mentioned that the same finding hasn't always been made outside of the United States. It's not exactly clear how universal this U shape is, but one possibility as to why you observe that in the US is that cognitive elites are more pro-social and therefore more concerned about the at least immediate interests of persons receiving welfare. Another possibility, however, goes back to what we were talking about before, namely that there's an instinctual preference perhaps to support redistribution, given that in our evolutionary past we lived in relatively small bands of hunter-gatherers where most people were somewhat closely related and where it was easy to monitor people's comings and goings, and hence the uninstinctual preference is to support less welfare. However, there's also an instinctual preference to favor the in-group, and the surveys consistently show that people with higher intelligence test scores are sort of less racist or exhibit lower out-group hostility. And so it's possible that because the United States is a ethnically factionalized country or has a relatively large amount of racial diversity, cognitive elites support welfare more than people in the middle of the intelligence distribution there, because they have a weaker preference, in-group preference, i.e. their preference in that regard is less instinctual, and it outweighs the less instinctual preference towards market mechanisms rather than welfare.
Yes, I am glad that you brought up the welfare point because multiracial states really invest in welfare due to ethnic tension. So, for example, if you live in a diverse country, you're less likely to invest in welfare because of the assumption that the beneficiary will not be of your race or ethnic group. This has been
Yes,
corroborated by many studies.
yes, there does seem to be quite a lot of evidence for that. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also another puzzling question. Noah, is the intelligent choice always the right choice? So, for example, one starts a YouTube channel to review toys or engage in pranks. Just to some, that's not particularly exciting, but that individual will generate revenue. Most YouTubers who make millions are not particularly serious. So I'm just giving an example, but is the intelligent choice always the right choice? So if you're really intelligent, would it make better sense to start a goofy YouTube channel or a serious YouTube channel?
Well, I suppose I'd say that de gustibus non est disputandum, that there's no accounting for preferences, and so some highly intelligent people find it congenial to use their time to do goofy things and others to do quantum physics, and I guess it's a matter of personal preference. So the intelligent choice isn't always the right choice by the standards of someone who believes that an unexamined life isn't worth living, but it is always the right choice by the standards of the person making it, I suppose.
Yeah, intelligent is contextual. So, for example, studies are not clear on the effects of woke politics on businesses. One study published by a Cambridge researcher argues that there isn't a relationship between identity politics and wealth formation. So it doesn't make much sense for a company like Twitter to take a political stance, but they do it because they understand the meta narrative. It's a way to keep them relevant.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly why so many large companies promote woke politics. I mean, one theory is sort of slightly conspiratorial theory, which a number of people have discussed, including Steve Saylor, is that it's a way of divide and conquering economic leftism. If everyone's talking about race and trans, then they're not concerned about taxation of large corporations or breaking up monopolies. There was a good article on this by Ed West a few years ago, in which he pointed out that I think it was Starbucks had launched this campaign where you were supposed to talk about race with your barista, and that had been launched just after a major tax scandal involving Starbucks. And so what they're effectively saying is, never mind our tax affairs, let's talk about how awful racism is.
Yeah, it has a camouflaging effect. So, for example, people are upset that Bill Gates is investing in agriculture, but this is my response. Bill Gates is a businessman who is quite successful and also ruthless. The Gates Foundation serves a purpose. As a businessman, your reputation should be palatable. So why should we expect Bill Gates to not invest in agriculture, energy, or another business that infuriates the moral sensibilities of leftists?
Yeah, I didn't realize he was investing in agriculture, and I didn't realize people were getting upset by that.
Yes, you have an article on Substack titled "Why Are People Always Upset Because of Nonsense?" Something to that effect.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you can tell us a little about it.
Yeah, so this is my most recent post on my Substack newsletter, which you can sign up for. And the title was "Why Do Woke Activists Complain About Trivial Things?" And it began with the example of a recent minor scandal in academia where a Journal of Hospital Medicine had published an article in which the authors warned about the effects of disciplinary silos in medicine, whereby people in, say, cardiology only talk to other cardiologists, and people in oncology only talk to other oncologists, and there's sort of animosity may develop between these two factions. And they use the word tribalism. And then when the study was published, lots of people got upset on Twitter about the fact they'd used the word tribalism, which they regarded as sort of somehow racist or white supremacist. And the journal editor naturally issued a groveling apology for this and actually retracted the article and republished it with a different word. So I was trying to work out why such a large number of people would bother complaining about something as trivial as a word like tribalism, which in any case has been used for years
For
to mean.
centuries,
I'm sorry?
tribalism has been invoked for centuries. No, I said
Yes, maybe
tribalism
it's
has
even
been
centuries.
invoked for centuries. Yes, there's nothing
Yes.
unusual
So
about the word. But continue.
yeah, so I was trying to work out why people would bother to complain about something as trivial as this, and I gave a couple of other examples. And I discussed three theories. One theory is that they generally are distressed, which seems difficult to believe, but it's possible given what we know about um, sort of the rise of safetyism and helicopter parenting and so on, something that's discussed in John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. So people today seem to be more emotionally fragile than they were in the past. The second theory is that sorts of people who complain about these things are have sort of Machiavellian personalities, and it's based on a recent study which documented correlations between dark triad personality traits and the proclivity to
And the
identify
victim,
oneself
I
as a
saw it.
victim. Yes, and Corey Clark wrote a good article about this in Quillette, where she unpacks the study. And then the third theory I discussed, which was sort of my novel contribution, is that academia seems to be a particularly frequent source of these kind of complaints about trivial things. And that might suggest a reason why they're being made, namely that in today's academia, it's very difficult to land a job, and everything is hyper competitive. And this can be the case at undergraduate level as well, when people are thrust into an environment in which everyone's clever. It's not just them anymore. It's not just a couple of other students they're competing with, but it's rather hundreds. And so complaining about something trivial like the use of the word tribalism, and then getting a victory in the form of a groveling apology or a promise to do better, qualifies as a personal accomplishment. And so even if you're not getting the best grades or landing your dream job, at least you can tell yourself that you're helping to promote social justice, at least as far as you see it.
Noah, I agree with you 100%. Recently, during a private correspondence with an anthropologist, I said to him, could participation on Twitter be a form of coalition building? In other words, people who are losers in real life decide that it makes sense to attack the characters of intellectuals and celebrities on Twitter in order to get ahead. If you're so for
Yes,
example,
that's
if you're a busy person, you should not and you will not have the time to say, oh, Noah Carl is racist. I don't have the time to talk about people. So most people who are very popular on Twitter are really losers in real life.
that could be the case.
Yes.
It's not implausible, but you're certainly your kind of coalition building uh, theory makes sense.
Yes, and I have always been baffled on the personality of the average Twitter user. A study was published by Mankind Quarterly or reported in Psychology Today, and someone decides to post it, and he or she, usually it's a she, the person gets angry, and the findings are never debunked, and we're not told why the study is flawed. So I don't get the point of Twitter really.
Yeah, well, yeah, Twitter is a world of extremes. It can be a really amusing and informative place if you follow the right people and you know spend your time wisely, but it can also be a source of much animosity and displeasure
And it can make
when
people
you end up
unhappy.
getting
Social media can make
targeted.
people unhappy because they tend to compare their achievements with those of individuals they don't even know and may never meet. Have you ever studied the relationship between social media use and intelligence?
I have not studied that, nor
Okay.
am I aware of any evidence on the question.
It can produce two results. One, people who use social media could be more intelligent because of access. So doctors are on social media, intellectuals are on social media. So that may be a selection bias. And two, excessive use on social media could be correlated with lower levels of intelligence because intelligent people are productive. Therefore, one with a real goal may not expend resources on social media. But I'm looking forward for someone like yourself to take up the mantle and do such a study.
Yeah, I agree that those two facts seem plausible and they work in opposite directions. So I don't know what the answer would be, to be honest.
Yeah, and but we're still on the topic of intelligence, and you also did a study you just study linking the relationship between IQ, political beliefs, and leftism. A professor at a university in Florida originally published a piece arguing that highly intelligent people are leftists, but they tend to be extremists. And you publish a report. So tell us a little about that study.
Yeah, so he argued that there's a consistent relationship between IQ and leftism, such that on social issues, or at least on issues that don't concern what he called ethnic and economic minorities, issues like abortion and gay marriage and immigration, so on. And those issues get a monotonically positive association between IQ and leftism. And then on issues where economic and racial minorities are concerned, you get the U shape that I described earlier. And I critiqued his analysis in several ways. First, by pointing out that it makes more sense to think of the political landscape of a country as having at least two axes, one running from left-wing economics to right-wing economics, and the other running from socially conservative views to socially liberal views. And this is indeed a schema that has been recommended by many commentators and political scientists. And once you adopt this schema, it no longer makes sense to say that IQ is always consistently correlated with leftism, because the social axis isn't necessarily an axis that conforms to what was traditionally understood by the term left, namely support for government control of the economy in opposition to interventionist foreign policy and support for make work schemes and things like this. So I went through in that critique a large number of measures from the General Social Survey that I mentioned earlier, and looked at the functional form of the relationship between vocabulary test score and the belief or attitude in question. And some of the measures I looked at did support this gentleman's theory in that there was a U-shaped relationship whereby the people of highest vocabulary test scores were more left-wing than people of middling intelligence. However, there were some other items, namely those pertaining to government control of economic matters, price controls, wage controls, things like that, where the relationship was the opposite of what he had claimed. In other words, people with higher vocabulary test scores were more right-wing. These are some of the measures that Kaplan had used in his study that we discussed earlier. And there have also been some studies in European countries, in Sweden and the UK, in which it's been found that people with higher cognitive ability have more right-wing views. There was a study published by Timothy Bates and one of his colleagues 1 or 2 years ago, which was well done and found a consistent positive relationship between IQ and right-wing beliefs. So this U-shape isn't always observed, and it's only been observed, to my knowledge, consistently in the United States when using IQ as the independent variable, that is.
Yes, but Noah, I think that the relationship is consistent between right-wing views and intellect, because individuals on the right tend to be less sentimental. They accept that we can never turn humans into angels, and they don't envision utopias. So maybe this could be a channel to which we have recognized the higher intelligence of right-wingers.
Yes, possibly. Although, yeah, many of the communist intellectuals of the past century and a half were presumably very intelligent, despite having what Thomas Sowell would call an unconstrained vision of human nature. So I'm not sure one's overall view of human nature is consistently related to intelligence in the way you've described.
Yes, but those communist intellectuals pretended to be. This is not a conversation about communism, but many of them pretended to be rational, but the evidence suggests that they were more sentimental than logical.
I agree that people on the right tend to be less sentimental in general, but whether that's related to IQ
That's
is
a
less
different
clear.
story.
Yeah.
And Noah, you also did a paper for the Adam Smith Institute arguing that academics skew left. What did you find? What are your results?
Yeah, so in that report I did for the Adam Smith Institute, I began by pointing out that there's a left-wing skew in academia, and then I considered some of the possible reasons, and then finally what, if anything, should be done about this. Of course, I'm by no means the first person to notice that people with left-wing views are overrepresented in academia. This has been documented for decades. I compiled some evidence which was available at the time for the UK and showed that based on the measures that were available, there seems to have been a decline in right-wing representation since the 1960s and a corresponding increase in left-wing representation. I compared some studies that had been done by the now deceased sociologist A.H. Halsey to some recent polls, which aren't perfect but aren't bad either. And they showed that the percentage of academics supporting left-wing parties in the UK is greater now than it was in the 1960s when Halsey did his first study. And more recently, Eric Kaufman, who I believe you've interviewed, has compiled a lot of evidence on this with respect to both the UK and the US. And there's now in some disciplines a really extreme skew such that almost no one in those disciplines appears to have conservative or right-wing views. Disciplines like sociology, anthropology, and to an even greater extent, the so-called studies disciplines like critical studies and gender studies and so on.
Yes.
So it varies on the discipline. If you go to business studies, you tend to find not a fair number of economic conservatives. Likewise for economics, you tend to find quite a few conservatives in engineering, but many fewer in the social sciences and almost none in some social sciences / humanities.
All right. But Noah, remember that intellectuals are smart people, but being an intellectual does not necessarily means that one has a very high IQ. Intellectuals reside in the world of ideas. So I think that this is one reason why they skew left. Left-leaning ideas are more romantic. And
Well,
secondly, yes?
I would say that in general, intellectuals do have high IQs. I mean, perhaps not in disciplines like gender studies and critical race theory, but in physics and
Yes.
philosophy, and
Physics, philosophy, those are the subjects for smart people.
but even in say quantitative political science and sociology, I think people are generally very smart, and in disciplines like history as well.
Yes. The research shows that philosophy and STEM, where graduates tend to be smart. I do
Yeah.
admit that intellectuals are brilliant people, but being an intellectual does not mean that you are a genius or that you're exceptionally bright.
No, it doesn't mean you're the smartest person around. I mean, people in other professions are also very bright, lawyers and investment bankers and so on.
Yes, and secondly, academia functions like a guild. So it would be feasible for intellectuals to be high in rule following because it's a guild. And in a guild, you want a particular worldview to succeed. Right wingers can be a bit more eccentric, and if right wing ideas become popular, then they can displace the prevailing orthodoxy. So again, academics could be skewing left because of economic issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the theories. And I think you're right to describe contemporary academia as a guild. This is something that Ed Dutton has talked a lot about. But as you mentioned, one of the possible reasons for academia's left liberal skew is that people with right-wing conservative views are more concerned about other things than about making contributions to scholarship. They tend to be, on average, more interested in earning money and in starting a family. And it's been shown in the US that this can partly explain why they're less likely to choose an academic career. and indeed, it's been found that people with left liberal views score higher on the personality dimension of openness, whereas conservatives score higher on the dimension of conscientiousness. Openness meaning the extent to which you're predisposed towards novelty seeking and new experiences, new ideas. Although, new ideas should come with a caveat, given the closed-mindedness of many contemporary
Exactly.
academics.
So again, maybe we need to identify the difference between openness to experiences and openness to ideas. Academics are open to experiences, but on the measure of openness intellect, I don't believe that they score highly.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, and I think more research needs to be done on the relationship between that construct and left liberalism in light of recent developments over the past 5 to 10 years,
Yes,
where a substantial number of people that identify with the label left liberal are showing themselves to be closed-minded rather than open-minded. But going back to the question of why there's a left liberal skew, I have discussed in that Adam Smith report and some other writings that it's also possible for the skew to have been brought about simply due to an initial slight skew becoming exaggerated over time via sociological processes of homophily. That's the tendency to prefer others
people
who are like
like us,
yourself.
yes.
Yeah, so even if the initial skew was, say, 60-40 left, right, I'm simplifying things here because as I mentioned before, political views are multidimensional, but let's just use left and right for the time being. Even if it was just initially 60-40, the left-wing portion could have gradually expanded as more left-wing people selected in to be around other left-wing people and more right-wing people selected out because they found the atmosphere uncongenial. And it's also another process that could have exerted this effect is people entering the profession and then adopting the positions of the median individual in that profession, or of, let's say, the most vocal members of that profession. So you graduate, you're relatively apolitical, and you find out that everyone in the common room, or people who are most vocal in the common room, have left-wing views, and you say, well, I better adopt left-wing views if I want to get ahead in this profession. So that's another mechanism by which the skew could have become
Yeah,
exaggerated over time.
I agree with Michael Woodley's idea, the cultural mediation hypothesis. I think it's quite plausible.
Yes. So what? Remind me exactly what he says.
So intelligent people are more likely to conform to cultural constructs. So Michael Woodley did research, I guess, in relation to Edward Dutton, who argued that
Yeah.
intelligent people are clever sillies. They are deficient in common sense. So he's arguing that it is about cultural evolution. If you're an intelligent person, you're going to promote ideas that are consistent with the dominant culture in order to improve your professional prospects.
Yes. There's definitely some truth in that. It's. I think it requires further analysis or further elaboration, however, because one also has to have a theory of where the dominant views came from in the first place. And the dominant views prior to the ascendance of the cultural left were not culturally left-wing ideas, i.e., back in the 1950s in Britain, the country was still relatively conservative and the establishment was still relatively conservative. So if intellectuals are better at conforming to the prevailing ideology, you would have expected them to remain conservative. Whereas even then, people like Orwell remarked on how left-wing they were.
Yes. So, but yes, a downside to Woodley's idea is that it doesn't account for the revolutionary attitudes of many intellectuals.
Indeed.
And revolutionary intellectuals are often remembered. So, for example, elites don't like Ayn Rand, but she's very popular. People love her today. Many philosophers are dead and forgotten, but Ayn Rand still remains widely appreciated by her fans, even though mainstream scholars contend that she's not a real philosopher.
Yes, and she's also very unappreciated by feminists,
Yeah,
despite being one of the most famous female scholars of all time.
exactly. But if you are a feminist, you should love Ayn Rand, and for obvious reasons. Ayn Rand was not afraid to engage in public debates. She had a very aggressive and dominant masculine intellect, and Rand did not care about the views of her enemies. So if you're a true feminist who believes in in the power of women, you should love Rand.
Well, I think that guy Stefan Molyneux, who's
Yes.
been kicked off social media, he once said that feminism is socialism with panties, and he got in
Yes, it
trouble for
is.
saying that.
Feminism selects for weakness. So, for example, women like Anna Arendt and Ayn Rand and Linda Gottfriedson are not appreciated by feminists. They tend to prefer weaker women who are not confident in their intellectual assertions.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say weaker. Some of the left wing feminists, I.e., feminists, I wouldn't characterize as intellectually weak in the sense that they've often made very bold assertions and have, not necessarily in always engaged in good faith with their intellectual opponents, but they've often been rather intellectually aggressive. But I would say left wing.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on feminism, but I think that feminism really exists to make women comfortable. It's not really about power, because when you study feminism carefully and their most revered thinkers, these people are uninterested in literally toppling the system. They want to inherit a system that was created by men. So, for example, it was once popular for feminists to distinguish between masculine ethics and feminist ethics, but modern feminists have no interest in sex differences, and real feminists promote sex differences because they think that women must embrace their womanhood and distinguish themselves from men.
Yes, I think there are a lot of inconsistencies in contemporary feminism, like the fact that they complain. This is a generalization, of course, but there seem to be more complaints about how many female billionaires there are than severe lack of women's rights in the Middle East.
In the Middle East, exactly. A real feminist would respond by saying, maybe men are billionaires because they have a greater desire for social status, and women don't care about social status as much as men. That is a feminist assumption. To argue that a woman should become a billionaire or scientist because men are billionaires is anti-feminism. You really
Yes, I
don't
think
respect women.
Susan Pinker has made this point.
Yes, I really like her articles.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But feminism are really deprecating womanhood. There's nothing wrong
No,
being a
yes, precisely.
nurturer.
Many contemporary feminists seem to want women to just be men.
Yes, and that's
And
anti-feminism.
they want women to be judged according to the standards that a male-dominated society has developed and promoted, rather than trying to bring women's standards into the conversation.
Exactly. Ethical feminism was popular in the 19th and the early 20th century, but few feminists today are worth my time. I like the Australian feminists. I think that they're pretty good. And I like Camille Paglia and
Yes,
Melanie
she's good fun.
Phillips. Some of them are good. Not all of them are inane. But this conversation is not about feminism, although it's an interesting topic. But Noah, you wrote another article and I really like it. It's titled "The Good Country Index: Cognitive Ability and Culture." Expound.
Yeah, so this was a paper co-authored with Heine Rinderman, where we examined this new measure of societal performance called the Good Country Index, which quantifies the extent to which countries act and produce things in the interests of the whole of humanity rather than just their own citizens. And so it includes dimensions corresponding to scientific innovations, health, peace and security, etc. And then we looked statistically to see whether it was correlated with average cognitive ability and the cognitive ability in the intellectual class, i.e. the 95th percentile of the distribution, as well as cultural factors, notably the percentage of Christians and the percentage of Muslims in the population, and estimated some models. And we concluded that both cognitive ability, particularly in the intellectual classes, as well as religion, seems to be strongly associated with this good country index.
Yes, IQ is an underestimated topic, Noah. Do you agree?
What do you mean by underestimated?
So, for example, there are many relations between IQ and favorable outcomes. As I've read Einar Rinderman, he's a interesting guy, but based on the media and what journalists often tell us, IQ seems to be discredited. I've read articles with titles like IQ is a form of pseudoscience, IQ is not a good predictor of income. But when you survey the literature properly, it becomes evident that IQ is linked to many variables, some even quite mundane. So, for example, low IQ countries are less likely to appreciate the benefits of scientific research. IQ below a certain level cannot accommodate innovations.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously disagree with the viewpoint that IQ is pseudoscience or has been discredited or something. Rather, it's not the only thing that matters in
Obviously, it's not
predicting
the only
people's
thing that
outcomes,
matters.
but it's definitely one of, if not the most important single constructs for predicting behavior in the social sciences. It's been called things like the most important construct in psychology.
Yeah,
and yes, indeed, when scholars have run horse races with IQ versus other psychological attributes, whether it's grit or conscientiousness
or even patience.
Or patience, those other variables do often have an effect, but it's usually smaller than IQ's effect.
Yes, so for example, patient is correlated with well-being, but IQ is a stronger predictor of well-being. Yeah, I've always read pieces on IQ, but I became really interested in the topic just like a few years ago, not long. And let me tell you why. IQ allows us to maneuver complex situations. So if you're an intelligent person, intuitively, IQ has analytical value. But because I consume foreign media extensively, I've recognized that the concept is not being taken seriously. And I am baffled because there's a big difference between listening to someone on CNN and reading an actual 50-page study. No comparison.
Yeah. Well, Steve Pinker has written about this most extensively in his book, The Blank Slate, and the question of why IQ is denied or attacked, particularly by intellectuals, and he begins by noting that it's highly ironic that intellectuals who in their day-to-day lives seem to be obsessed with intelligence, constantly talking about which student is the brightest or who's written the smartest paper, are among those most critical of attempts to measure this phenomenon. And in his book, he identifies a number of fears that motivate denial or criticism of IQ. I mean, he's also talking about behavioral genetics, but the field of individual differences, let's say. And so he discusses the fear of inequality, the fear that if there's such a thing as IQ, then we're not all equal to one another, which is sort of trivially false. But many people nonetheless cling to it as a belief. He also identifies the fear of imperfectibility. If we have IQ scores and if they're partly or largely genetically influenced, then we won't be able to, create a utopia as many left-wing intellectuals have desired. And there's a few other of these kind of fears that he discusses in the book.
Yes, and again, intellectuals are romantics. I think that's something you should study. Why do intellectuals prefer romantic notions? Irving Babbitt touched on the issue some years ago, but I want an empirical study, and he seemed to be quite brave.
Yeah, it's a good question of why the people who populate universities tend to be romantic and sentimental rather than hard-nosed and concerned only with the data. Perhaps, of course, as I discussed in a recent conversation with Dutton, if you go back only to the 19th century in Britain or earlier, universities were hotbeds of clerical activism. They weren't anything like the model of Plato's Academy. It was only for a comparatively brief period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that they upheld true scholarly ideals, not perfectly, but to a much better extent than they're doing now. So one could reverse the question and ask, what was so special about the late 19th and 20th centuries? How were we able to overcome these ideological and religious impulses and have relatively well-functioning universities?
Yes, quite interesting areas to research. But Noah, you also wrote a paper, and I read it all. I get 35 pages titled Human Rights, Why Countries Differ. And for those who are not familiar with the history of Christianity, the responses are striking. According to your research, Christianity is a very potent predictor of protection for human rights. And you compare Christianity to Islam.
Yeah, so that was a somewhat similar paper to the Good Country Index paper. It was a country level analysis with a theoretical component attached, and we quantified human rights based on this data set where the researchers have used Amnesty International and I believe the US State Department sources to rate the quality of human rights in different countries in different times. And like in many indexes, there are different sub-dimensions. So there's a women's rights component and a free speech component and a freedom of religion component, etc. And we took several of these and put them into a single index and then looked at what country level factors were most strongly associated with them. And we found that percentage of Christians in the population or the percentage of Christians minus the percentage of Muslims was a particularly strong predictor. And in the multivariate analysis was actually a better predictor than average cognitive ability. Somewhat surprising. And then we had a sort of theoretical section explaining why that might be.
Yes, there is a strong presumption of reason in Christianity, and secondly, since antiquity, Christians have recognized that there's a difference between the temporal realm and the spiritual realm. So I wasn't surprised. The concept of religious freedom actually emerged in Christianity.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah, I
was,
mean,
you may
sorry.
continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that has this relation between Christianity and uh, human behavior that could be seen as relevant to human rights has actually been discussed a great deal over the past couple of years. There have been two books making a broadly similar thesis. There was the Weirdest People in the World by
Yes,
Joe Henrich.
I'm reading that now.
Yeah, in which he basically argues that the Western Christian Church played a key role in setting up the conditions that led to the ascent of the West and the development of what he calls weird behavior. That's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic behavior. And the second book, which makes a relatively similar thesis, is Dominion by the historian Tom
Tom
Holland.
Holland, yes.
I haven't read that one, but I understand he kind of traces the development of Western culture through history, with identifying a particularly important role of Christianity, and argues that many of the concepts that we now take for granted are ultimately Christian in origin.
Yes, it's a very interesting argument, and someone you could consult is John Witt, or maybe it's Witt. I don't know if Witt is a German name, but are you familiar with that writer?
I'm not.
Yeah, Witte. He's really compelling, and his papers are accessible online. But Noah, we're now going to move on to immigration, but we're not going to dwell on the topic. You did a paper evaluating stereotypes we associate with immigration, which it was done in conjunction with Emil O.W. Kierkegaard and Julius D. Beji. I can't pronounce that name. Are Danes' immigration policy preferences based on accurate stereotypes?
Yeah, so as you may be aware, but as many people are not, there's a large literature on stereotype accuracy, and which finds that, generally speaking, stereotypes that people have about different groups in society tend to be quite accurate.
Noah, I have to make this point. If there was not a kernel of truth to stereotypes, they would not exist. It's
I
quite
agree. Yeah.
obvious.
And indeed, it would be amazing if they weren't accurate, because otherwise we would have evolved to hold systematically biased information about important aspects of our social milieu, which we obviously didn't evolve to do. But generally, when you evaluate stereotypes, which has been done for decades, you take a sample of people and you ask them to either rank different groups. It could be genders, races, nationalities, income groups, in order with respect to some variable, or you ask them to estimate like the average value for that group for a particular variable, and then you correlate the average scores or values obtained from your sample of respondents with the true values for those variables, and you generally find a reasonably high degree of accuracy. In other words, when you ask people to say which of the genders is more likely to be represented in engineering and which one is more likely to be represented in nursing, people are well aware that there are more men in engineering and more women in nursing, and so on. And so in our study, we applied these methods to different nationalities of immigrant groups in Denmark, and asked a sample of respondents to estimate the net fiscal contribution of each of these nationalities. If I recall correctly, we just asked them to give a value on a sort of 7-point scale or something.
No, you can just give the results. You don't need to explore too deeply.
Yeah. So what we found is that there was a relatively strong correlation, as is typically found, so that people in this sample of Danish respondents had a good idea about which nationalities on average have a positive fiscal contribution and which ones on average have a negative fiscal contribution. We also found that their estimates of the fiscal contribution of these different groups were correlated with their preference for or against more immigration of those groups.
Yes. I think that it is feasible to import immigrants based on their productivity levels. A point-based immigration system is not racist. Racist is quite logical and sensible. If people from a particular country are less likely to innovate and develop the host country, why should you accept them or market your country to such individuals? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. I suppose I would agree that points-based systems makes
Yeah,
the most sense.
and America was very serious in relation to immigration in the past, but during the 1960s, new laws were passed and it became easier for people to migrate. So, for example, in some countries, anyone can go to the embassy and get a US visa. I think Americans should become more selective, especially in the era of COVID, where we notice that economies are not as dynamic as they were in the past.
Yeah, what's interesting in the COVID era, how many commentators who, under usual circumstances, would be vociferously opposed to immigration controls, have been among their most outspoken supporters. I mean, it's a different context, a dangerous disease versus
Yes.
normal
Yeah.
circumstances. But it's interesting
And
how quickly that switch
yeah,
happened.
and no, it must be noted that scholars have actually proven the magnet hypothesis. People do migrate to countries that provide welfare.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
there's
so
evidence for that.
these issues may sound controversial to the media or to average people, but they are not in reality. Now, Noah, for a short time, we're going to talk about race. You wrote a piece on COVID-19 and you wanted us to discuss it. So you can go ahead. It was published for Medium, and you argued that maybe blacks are likely to contract COVID-19 because of vitamin D deficiency.
Yeah, so in that piece, I asked, are socioeconomic factors sufficient to account for the racial disparities in COVID outcomes in the US and the UK? And I concluded they probably weren't. So what you find in Britain is that uh, Black Britons and South Asian Britons have been more likely to die of COVID-19, conditional on age and on geographical location, than white or Chinese origin Britons. And in the US, you found approximately the same thing, with East Asian Americans having roughly the same outcomes as white Americans, and Black and Hispanic Americans having slightly worse outcomes, usually controlled for important, most important factors, age and geography. And so I explored why this might be. And one possibility, of course, is that there's some aspect of exposure to the virus that isn't captured by basic controls like age and geography. And once you, like, for example, the representation in frontline work, i.e., in the healthcare sector or in being a security guard or a taxi driver or something like that. However, there's reason to believe that that can't account for the remaining disparity, because in the UK, we have reasonably good data on the number of NHS staff who've died of COVID-19, and sadly, a relatively large number died in the first wave. And it's been found that 60 or 70% of those NHS staff who died were Black or Asian Britons. And yet those two groups comprise much less than 70% of NHS staff. And so it's hard to see how any factor other than some kind of behavioral
Genetics.
or biological difference could explain that difference.
Yes.
Because if you go to doctors and dentists in particular, which is the highest status groups within the NHS, there I think it was about 90% of those who died were Black or Asian. So you can't explain that with reference to sort of structural racism or inequality.
All
It's
right.
more likely to be due to pre-existing conditions or perhaps vitamin D deficiency. I mean, I should say about the vitamin D hypothesis that it's perhaps looking not quite as promising now as it was then. There still seems to be some evidence for it, but the definitive evidence definitive evidence of its relevance hasn't yet been reported. So I'm not entirely convinced that it's vitamin D that accounts for the disparity, although it could be.
Well, a study published in JAMA attributed higher transmission rates in the black population to genetics. But we're going to move on and speak briefly about a paper you wrote titled how stifling debate around race, genes, and IQ can do harm. And I'm going to read a snippet. Pharmacogenetic research in the past few decades has uncovered significant differences among racial and ethnic groups in the metabolism, clinical effectiveness, and side effect profiles of many clinically important drugs. These differences must be taken into account in the design of cost management policies such as formulary implementation, therapeutic substitution, and step care protocols. If we were able to study racial differences, then diseases would be fewer. By this time, it would have been possible to identify some cures. Or maybe I'm being optimistic, but you get the point.
Yes, no, of course I agree with you that we should use whichever concepts are best able to uh, assist us in finding the truth about things. And one of those things we want to find the truth out about is medicine, so we can save people's lives. And it turns out in medicine that there are often important different average differences between members of different racial groups, whether you conceptualize race as self-reported ethnicity or in terms of ancestry, and we should certainly take those things into account where they are relevant.
Yes, and Noah, is race a valuable analytical tool? I read your reviews of Angela Saini and Adam Rutherford, and in the Saini review, you tell us what sensible people know that skull data can accurately predict race.
Yeah, well, yeah, my view is that that race is a useful category, although it's not the only relevant category for describing human genetic variation or biological variation, and it has to be defined carefully with the appropriate caveats and so on. But you have obviously now you have people, including some geneticists, arguing that race bears absolutely no relation to human genetic data, and the term should be discarded. But that's from my point of view, that is only justified if you define race in a way that very few important scientists have ever defined it as. If you define it as completely biologically distinct groups, then obviously no such concept can be justified, because the different racial groups we see in humans are not completely biologically distinct. And it's not even clear what that would mean.
I
But if you look at the way that Charles Darwin or Theodosius Dobzhansky or Ernst Mayr use the term race, I think it's perfectly valid, and it just refers to groups whose members
yeah.
have a common ancestry and that were shaped by particular conditions in the geographic regions in which they evolved.
Yes, race is a linguistic construct. Arguing that race should not be taken seriously because it is socially defined is quite foolish. All constructs are socially defined. And furthermore, using the term population differences will not eliminate racial differences.
That's right.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And
Yes,
Stephen,
sorry.
we won't speak for a long time on this issue, but some years ago, a researcher, Jason Lewis, actually debunked the findings of Stephen Gould, noting that his data and research on skulls were not really correct.
Yeah, my understanding is that very little of what Gould said in his book The Mismeasure of Man was correct.
But Stephen Jay Gould is still held up as the beacon of science.
Yeah,
I'm a fan
interesting.
of some of his ideas, but when a man is inaccurate, just say it. Don't idolize illogic.
Yeah, I mean his writings on animal evolution and on the Cambrian explosion were quite useful and very lively and interesting. But his writings on intelligence are not particularly informative. That was in the survey that Rinderman and colleagues did of IQ researchers a couple of years ago.
It's genetic.
They asked to rate the truthfulness of different persons from the history of intelligence research, and they were asked to rate Stephen Jay Gould, and he received a very low average rating, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, but here's the problem with the study that Rinderman did. The people who argue that Stephen Jay Gould should not be taken seriously in relation to some issues are not going to make this assertion in public.
You mean they're too afraid?
Exactly my point. So in a normal interview, they're going to say that Stephen Jay Gould was a brilliant guy and he was right on skulls.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, a lot of people don't want to reveal their true beliefs about these controversial matters.
But before we go, I have one question. Noah, how old are you?
31.
Oh, you're 31. You're pretty young. I'm 27. Yeah,
Only 31.
you're pretty young. So, and what do you do now? You're a researcher. Are you affiliated with an institution?
No, I'm just an independent writer and researcher, writing for different outlets like Quillette and
Okay.
Lockdown Skeptics,
Yes.
Unheard, and RT. And I've got my newsletter that I mentioned as well.
Okay. But someone like so Noah, this is the plan. Recently I was in a podcast with some other young people and one works in tech and I said, it's good that you're an entrepreneur. So as an entrepreneur, you make money and you give it to people like me to start research institutes. I don't believe that dissident researchers should coddle the mainstream. We should start our own platforms. It doesn't make any sense to write for the New York Times. Start your own publication, but to do that, you need money. But I am not interested in ingratiating myself with normies. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm interested in people who are also who are interesting.
Yes. So it was a pleasure to speak to you, Noah. And at some point, we will talk again. And if you wish, you may share it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All
It
right.
was great to speak with you.
Yes. Bye. All
Bye.
right.